Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was originally released in Japan for the Famicom in 1990. Despite the growing popularity of the Fire Emblem series, this title was never released outside of Japan, shocking as it was the first game in the series. That's changed this month though, with Nintendo releasing a full English localization of the classic NES game along with some quality of life improvements, letting fans play the game that started it all for the first time outside of Japan. Being a game from the early 90s, I didn't expect an amazing well-presented story. After all, this is an old Famicom game, limited by the 8-bit era of gaming. I was right, the story boils down to Marth losing his kingdom and going after a magical sword and the Fire Emblem in order to win back his home. It's a long journey of redemption, which is fine. The problem was the lack of opportunity to learn more about these characters, both the main and side characters. There just weren't enough chances to get to really know any of these soldiers outside of the minimum we learn about Marth. In retrospect, I think it shows how far the series has come and how much the template for the series has evolved, how it set the foundation for the future to come. However, this also meant that its story hasn't aged well from the 2020 perspective. It's simple, very vanilla, and just not much to it. Immediately starting Shadow Dragon's campaign, I felt a familiar and almost nostalgic feeling for its gameplay. These were the beginnings of one of my favorite Nintendo series, and it's easy to recognize how this title would not only lay the groundwork for its series, but for the genre. The 24-chapter story is broken up into battle maps layered with a grid and a unique enemy layout per map. The goal per chapter varies depending on the level. You might go after a castle, try to defeat a specific enemy, or defend a castle fort. During your turns, you move your characters one by one, attack enemies, and send soldiers to convoys to either swap weapons or recruit more soldiers. That was perhaps the biggest change I had to adapt to. I was so used to easily being able to manage my resources in newer titles, but in this one, I have to physically move to every location, and the developers were very much aware of that. Sometimes the locations of these convoys are surrounded by enemies, strategically pushing the player for confrontation should they need a weapon fixed mid-battle or perhaps need more soldiers. This made unit placement incredibly important, way more than the recent Fire Emblem games that were released. It's a game of risk and reward as you gamble sending your wounded soldier toward a group of 3 weaker soldiers that offer an equal chance of victory or failure. Luckily for those wanting to avoid some of the challenges or anxiety of losing your soldiers, Nintendo has implemented a rewind and bookmark feature that essentially offers save states for maps. Sadly, you can only have one of these active at a time, so you'll want to use them wisely. In addition to this, Nintendo added the ability to fast forward animations, speeding up the clunky slow gameplay of the original. Ultimately, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and Blade of Light may not hold up as well as it did back in the 90s. Some quality of life improvements alleviate that, but not to the extent to make the experience entirely enjoyable. With that said, for a series that is known for its challenge and making every decision count, it's fun to see that still hold true with the game that started it all. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light may have been a bit too ambitious for the hardware it started on, but there's no doubt that you can see just how far ahead of their time Nintendo was with this series. Let's just get this out of the way. This is an NES game, it's limited by the era it came out in, and it's not the prettiest looking NES game. The blocky art style of everything hasn't aged well, but I did find it fascinating to see the aspects of the box art get translated into the game. If anything, it helped me appreciate the lengths the game developers went to bring these games to life with the limited technology of the early 90s. However, even now in 2020, there are nicer looking games on this platform. I did at least like the character portraits for soldiers and main characters. I thought it was fascinating to see the early renditions of what would become iconic characters in this series. At least Nintendo has added some visual modifiers to the gameplay to add a bit more modern game mechanics to the classic. You can play Fire Emblem in a more stretched out look to have more of the screen fill up, or you can run it in pixel perfect mode that keeps its original resolution but shrinks the gameplay a bit. Ultimately, I went with the more filled out look, but just because it looks better on a TV, though I found myself actively switching to the pixel perfect mode when playing in handheld mode. If there's anything that's aged the best with this title, is the MIDI tracks that still capture the magic and wonder of the Fire Emblem series. I found myself occasionally closing my eyes and just listening to the music, imagining what the game developers saw the game's visuals would represent. Of course, there's no voice acting here with the era this title came out in, but as far as music and sound effects go, Nintendo did a great job with this one. Part of me does wish we would have gotten some HD Rumble support on the Switch though. It's minimal with a title like this, sure, but I think it'd go a long way even if it is a simple title like this. At its $5.99 limited digital release, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light is a simple but long-awaited localization treat for fans of the Fire Emblem series. I don't think this title aged well enough to warrant actively wanting to replay the whole thing unless you're that diehard of a Fire Emblem fan. Where it is neat though is being able to see the origins of this series and how it evolved over the years. Just don't expect to learn much about your soldiers or take them out for tea. It's available until March 31st, 2021, so pick it up if you want to try a dated and incredibly challenging RTS with a lot of meaningful video game history thrown into it.